right, so I'm going to be painting Kritza the Rat Prince, which is a Warhammer Age of Sigmar model. He is a vampire lord, and he is Christmas themed because he's like the Rat King from the Nutcracker. So I assume this video will be coming out sometime before Christmas, maybe. Or did I just date the whole project?
No, you're good.
Okay,
Great.
we're good. So I'm gonna start using, this is a contrast paint called Flesh Terrors Red. One of the great things about contrast paints is it goes on kind of thinner and flows into the recesses. So you can kind of use your brush to kind of guide it and get it to flow down into those recesses. And then instead of doing a base layer and then a highlight layer later, with just one layer of paint, I can get a nice flowing look to it. Now I'm doing the red on the cape first because red is one of those things that tends to overwhelm other colors if you mess up. So right now I'm just kind of going along the edge of the cape, being careful not to get his little rat tails. They are literally rat tails coming out from his cloak because again, he is a vampire who is kind of rat themed. His whole ability in game is that he can turn into a swarm of rats to escape. And so if you kill him, you actually have to roll to decide whether you actually killed him or whether he just poofed into a pile of rats and ran away. So even though I'm using a larger brush here so I can get good coverage on the cape, I'm now getting into some like closer, smaller areas. So I'm being really careful not to get it onto the rest of the model here. Obviously I primed this guy white, and the reason I did that is because white works really well for these contrast paints. Now I'm just kind of looking over to make sure that the shadows of the contrast paints are in the shadows of the robe. So it's got these nice highlighted areas. That's going to be like a really nice bright color on the robe. Got a little bit more robe over here, so we'll touch that up. This part's actually thinner, so we're going to switch brushes. I'm going to rinse out this brush because you never want to let paint dry on a brush. It's a great way to kill your brush. I'm going to use a smaller brush to get into some of these smaller areas here. So again, I'm not being very careful about how much I put on the brush because with contrast paints, a lot of it is this kind of pushing the paint around with the brush. If you're using thicker paints, you do want to be careful as to how much you're putting on the brush. Sometimes you thin down the paint with water. In fact, a lot of times you thin down the paint with water to make sure that you don't get like a gloop of paint on the model, because that's not going to look very good. You want the paint to look flat on the model because that's going to make it look like the thing that you're painting is the color you're painting it, rather than the thing that you're painting having a layer of paint on top of it. Because we're going for the illusion of reality here, right? That I didn't just paint this guy's cloak red, he has a red cloak, just a very small red cloak. So now he's got this cloak on the inside, which probably no one's gonna see from the tabletop, but I will know it's there. So I'm gonna try to very carefully paint further back in while not getting red paint on his boots, because I'm gonna wanna paint those a brown later on, and I don't wanna have to touch them up and cover up red paint that I messed up with. So I'm gonna be very careful here and get all those details in. Try to get over here like this. I missed a little spot here on the edge of the cloak, so we're going to just very carefully run it along down the edge of the cloak there. All right. Fortunately, sometimes models have these areas that are harder to get to once you put it on the base. A lot of people, as a result, will actually glue their model to a folded out paper clip. So they've got it on like a wire, and then they'll stick the other end of that paper clip wire into like a wine cork and use that. I like putting models on their base first though, because one, it means I can play with them even if I haven't fully painted them yet, which encourages me to want to paint them, because once you've got the model built and you've played with it, you're then like, wouldn't you look cool with paint on it? Oh, I got just a little bit of red onto the base here. I don't want it to stay that way, so I'm actually gonna put a lot of water on my brush and try to dilute that red and then pull it off. This way, if you get the paint while it's still wet, you can get most of it off. We're gonna end up painting a cobblestone base on top of this, so it's not the worst thing if there's still a little red there, because it'll get covered up by a dark gray later on, but I don't really wanna let it sit there and dry. So there's just one more spot that I've missed here with the red. And then the red should be good. And I'm just gonna do a once over, kind of rotate it around, see if there are any spots that I missed. Managed to keep the red off the parts of the model, but got it on my hand. I'm bleeding. I'm not actually bleeding, it's just paint. By the time that I'm done painting, my hands do seem to end up with just about as much paint on them as the model, but such is life. And you can see at this point, while the recessed parts of the red are still drying, those highlighted parts, those lighter shades, are actually almost already dry at this point. So we're gonna wait for that to dry as we then switch over to another color. We're gonna do a dark purple for his pants and then a lighter purple for his doublet. And I think that's gonna look really good and kind of contrast with the red there. All right, so this guy doesn't have very much showing of his pants because his boots go up over the knee. So this dark purple I'm gonna use for the pants is really not even gonna register as a purple most of the time. It's gonna almost look black compared to how bright the red is next to it. But it's gonna give kind of a darker area of the model. You don't want your whole model to be super bright. It kind of washes out those other brighter colors. So in this case, using this dark purple for the pants here allows the red cloak around it to kind of shine all the more by comparison. So there's that step. Very fast, because there wasn't a whole lot there. Now we're gonna use a brighter purple for his doublet, because I like the idea, like this guy's got a cane and a sword and a cape. Like he is a person who just kind of screams to me like arrogance and that. So we're gonna do this bright purple on his chest. And it's gonna be, I think, the first thing you see when you look at the front of the model. If you look at him from the back, you're gonna see his red cape first. But if you look at him from the front, you're gonna see this bright purple doublet. And I just think it'll speak to, again, that kind of arrogance, that vampire lord aesthetic that this model is clearly designed with. And so we're gonna try to bring that out in the paint colors that we use. So yeah, that's gonna be nice and bright there. Now, he's got this like high collar on there. I'm actually gonna use an even smaller brush to get at that collar, because what I don't wanna do is get the purple up onto the face or onto the like fur cloak trim that he has, because I want that to be other colors. And again, this very vibrant purple is gonna be a lot harder to like cover up with other things. It's a lot easier if the purple stays where it's supposed to, which is why I'm doing it early, so that way when I do the details of his face, etc., that'll all look the way it should. All right, so there's his doublet. Let me double check. Okay, it's not visible from his back that he has any more of that doublet. Everything's covered up by the cloak. So, next we're gonna do his boots. He's got these very tall boots. I'm gonna use this kind of reddish brown. I'm gonna see how it works. I'm not actually sure, but I think it's gonna look good with the combination of the purple and the red. It's gonna end up kind of tying in with that, because I'm not using a very like cool brown. It's like a very warm, almost kind of reddish brown. And again, I like the idea that like, yeah, this guy did not just like buy a pair of boots. He had these, of course, like custom made for him. He's a member of the nobility. I'm making a story for him as I go, right? But that then means when I'm playing with him on the tabletop, because I play miniatures wargaming, that's what I do all the painting for, right? Then it's like, I know this guy, he's not just another dude, right? He's a guy that has these boots that he has had custom made for him, and I've painted them kind of with that idea in mind. So I like kind of telling those stories or coming up with those character details as I'm painting. So again, this is all contrast paint, so the darker part of the brown is really just pooling into the recesses. It's really a beautiful model. It's got these like little folds in the boot itself, so I don't have to go back through and try to give the illusion that there is depth and detail to the boot. It's already modeled on there. All I'm doing is pushing the paint in and around there to make sure that what should be a raised highlighted section is actually raised and highlighted, and what should be kind of a shadowy section is recessed in the shadows. There's a little bit of his boot there that's covered by the cape. Again, I don't think anyone else will ever see it, but I'll know it's there. So I'm gonna make sure it's there. Oh, I got a little bit of the brown on his cane. Now that's okay because it's gonna end up being a wooden cane anyway, so I'm gonna use a darker brown on that later. But I am gonna try to clear off the excess on there so that it discolors the cane as little as possible. All right, so one of the nice things here is that I'm kind of working on this as other parts are drying. Oh, missed a little spot on the boot here. But I can do that because I'm not really working on areas that touch each other very much. And so as I start going, if you're painting just one miniature at a time, you kind of want to make sure that you are not having your paints mixed together where you don't want them to. A lot of times when you're painting like a group of miniatures, people will batch paint, meaning that they are just doing just the brown boots on like 10 guys in a row. So by the time you finish guy number 10, the boot should be dry on the first guy. Since I'm not doing that, since I'm just painting this one guy, I'm actually gonna paint his hair next, because I'm gonna paint his hair this black color, and I want that to fully dry before I start trying to paint the face, because the face is gonna be much lighter in comparison to the hair. So we're gonna get this black going on his hair, try to keep that hairline. He's got a bit of a widow's peak here, not bad for a, however many 100-year-old vampire that he is. Gonna come under his sword over here. Kind of, again, we're pushing these thinner contrast paints into the recesses. I want the underside of his hair to be a little darker. What I really like about this black color, it's called Black Templar, is it almost comes out more of like a gray, which is what you want because black actually doesn't do layers very well. Like you try finding different shades of black, it's kind of hard to differentiate. Whereas really what you're going for is that the shadows look black and the raised portions look more like a kind of dark gray. And so that I think is going to give it a more realistic kind of hair look and also imply that this guy is old, right? Like he's a vampire, he has a curse of eternal undeath, but he's not a young guy, His hair is black, but it's kind of black headed towards gray. And I think that that kind of fits in again with this image I have of the character in my head. So I'm going around making sure that his hairline actually looks good. Got a little bit under there. All right. And now we've got his hair all done. And that way that part can be drying while we work on other parts of the model. Honestly, the main thing was that painting the base is going to be a pain because of his little rat tails. And so I had put him off until now because of that, and I'm not planning on doing the base today.
That seems like a good idea.
Because I was like, oh hey, I don't want to have to like do all the like little plants and all that. I'll do like this cobblestone with and like in foam. But then like an idiot I was like, so I'll paint each square dark gray, and then I'll put on the left and right, the bottom and right edge, a lighter gray to highlight it. So it ends up being, honestly, the most tedious part of the miniature because I'm a dummy, and it was like, this'll be cool, and it is cool.
And it will be cool and will be worth it.
Yes, it just, it always, I'm like, yes, just the base to do, and then I spend like an hour just on the base. And you're like, oh, well, nevertheless. Man, yeah, you can already see how that red is coming out on the cloak there.
It's really good.
Yeah, contrast paints are basically magic. All right, so next while I'm waiting for those other bits to dry, I'm gonna go ahead and paint the like wooden section of the cane. This paint is interesting to me, Wildwood. Again, it's a contrast, so it's gonna pull in the recesses, but this cane doesn't have any recesses. So if you're not careful, what it'll do is pull the darker brown, which is gonna actually read as black to the eye, and you're not gonna see that it's supposed to be a wooden cane. So I just use one dip into the paint pot to paint the whole cane to try to push it around so that way the brown is more visible on the part of the model that people are more likely to see. It's also a bit of a cooler brown than the warm kind of reddish brown of his boots, and that's on purpose. I don't want the boots to end up looking like they're made out of the same material that the cane is made out of, because the boots are leather and the cane is wood. So now that that's all done, he's got this very interesting kind of like shawl cloak that goes over his shoulders and then down his back. And it's got these rat heads on it. So I have this like pink contrast I'm going to use later. It's kind of flesh toned for the rats' faces, but I want the rest of it to be a gray because that to me kind of reads as almost a rat-like color. I thought about using black, but since I already used the black for his hair, I don't want his cloak and his hair to be the same color because again, I want to emphasize that they're different things. So I found this gray that comes out, the recesses come out black, but the raised part comes out this much kind of warmer gray look than the kind of bluish gray of his hair. And I think that's gonna really read to the brain as two totally separate materials, even though technically they're both variations on gray. And so this, again, one of the wonderful things about contrast paints is the way they take to these fur-like tufts, right? Like this is not a smooth fabric, right? It's supposed to be fur, and it's kind of got all these little kind of divots in it. And this is really where contrast paints shine. I'm using basically almost exclusively contrast paints on this for everything that's not metallic. And that's one, because I think they're really beginner friendly and I'm trying to illustrate kind of a beginning paint job. But like this is how I would paint this even if I wasn't doing the beginner version, just because like this type of paint works so well for this type of surface. Now, if I was painting a vehicle with lots of like flat panels, contrast paints are really terrible for that actually, because they want to pool down into those recesses. But if you have all these flat panels with no recesses, then it's just going to end up looking blotchy and it's not going to give you the look that you want. But for this type of model, so I'm going to get up under that arm really quick. For this type of model, it really is exactly what I want. Now, maybe the only other thing I might do if I like really wanted to push this over the top was then go back through with a very light dry brush on this fur and dry brush the kind of edges of the fur almost like a white. And that's so you've got this like gray with kind of these like white tips to the fur to really emphasize that these are like multiple rats that have been stitched together to form his cloak. Again, it's a Christmas theme, right? He's the rat prince. It's basically the Rat King from the Nutcracker. I definitely didn't just make up this theme to justify painting the miniature I wanted to paint anyway. So we're gonna keep working our way around here. Again, I'm trying to be really careful to not paint over the rats' faces, because those faces I'm gonna use a much lighter kind of flesh tone pink. And if the gray and the pink kind of overlap, it's gonna get really muddy looking and it's not gonna look very good. So I'm trying to avoid that as I come around, but there's also not a clear delineation between where the fur ends and the face begins. So I'm having to kind of make that as a judgment call here. I actually just painted over the ear of one of the faces, which I've been avoiding with all the other faces, but I don't think it's gonna show up on the final, like at the end when you look at the model, because it's down here kind of below his hair. It's not going to be super visible. If I was being really nitpicky, I would go back and fix that so that it all looks exactly the way that I envisioned it in my head. But who has time for that? I think it's still going to look just fine, even with one ear technically being a different color than it should be. Maybe he's just a rat that has a darker colored ear, you know? Who could say? These are multiple rats kind of stitched together. They don't all have to look 100% uniform to still sell the impression of what they're doing. I'm gonna go back down here. I'm not super happy with the way that the edge of this is lighter colored next to the red. I want to give a really clear delineation of where the end is. So I'm gonna pull a little heavier so that it has this dark kind of recess along the edge of the cloak, which will really, I think, read as a shadow when you look at the model when it's all done. All right, so we're coming around on kind of the edge of the cloak here. I'm not too concerned about if I run this over the sword blade, because I'm gonna use a silver metallic paint for the sword blade, and metallic paints are really thick in order to get that kind of metallic shine to them. And as a result, they cover up whatever's below them really well. So I'm not too worried about the sword having anything underneath it, because it'll just cover that up when it gets there. So now this last section here, while I'm not worried about the sword, I am worried about the gray getting onto his face, his hand, or onto that beautiful purple that we painted earlier. So we're gonna be really careful here and kind of pushing the paint around and get it down to the head here without getting it on to the surrounding cloth. And there's our cloak. So spin it around. Make sure I didn't miss anything like this section that I missed right here. Paint back over that. All right, so all this visible stuff is good, but I noticed as I spun it around that the underside here has a little bit of more of the fur that, again, no one will see from the tabletop, but I will know it's there. So we're gonna just paint under that a little bit. And now, oh, we've got the underside of the edge of the cloak on this side that I didn't give that pooling that I gave on the other side. So we're gonna go through and just give that a little extra definition so that way, again, it reads as a shadow when you look at it. Oh, one more missed spot over here. All right, so there's his cloak. I think that looks pretty nice and contrasts wonderfully with the red there. But I like the idea that vampires are so old school that they're like, no, I'm keeping my copper blade. I'm just gonna use magic so that it's as good as a steel blade. That just feels very like that kind of, again, that vampiric arrogance that, of course, nothing that's new, nothing that's been developed since they were turned into a vampire could ever be as good as, you know, what they had. And again, I like making these narratives as I go. And I also think the copper really, you know, contrasts well with the rest of the miniature, right? Like the metallic silver would look, I think, a little more similar to the gray that we've got for the rat pelt, whereas this copper, again, it's got that kind of like reddish warm tone. He's got this red kind of cloak to him, but also it's gonna still stick out. It's gonna still look different because it's kind of shiny. It's kind of a different style of paint. Now in this case, I'm literally just kind of blocking in everything with copper. I'm not too worried actually about giving this like highlight definition and stuff. One, because the blade's pretty thin, so it's not gonna matter that much. And two, because, spoilers for later, I have this paint that mimics a blood effect, and he's a vampire. Of course his blade's gonna have some blood on it. So there's his sword. Oh, missed a little spot underneath there.
It's basically a bob for him.
Yeah, exactly. There's his sword. Now we're going to use the silver for the hilt to, again, contrast with that kind of coppery blade. I go back and forth as to whether I want the gold hilt or the silver hilt, but the silver and the copper just are so different looking from each other, whereas the gold and the copper kind of look a little similar. So we're gonna give the hilt this silvery look to it. And we'll come back later with some, with a kind of dark gray wash in order to kind of fill in the recesses of the silvery hilt so that it doesn't look quite so flat. But we're gonna just paint that right now, making sure that we're missing the hand because we're gonna go back later and make sure that the hand is painted to match the face once we paint the face. But again, I like to do the metallics first. It's a lot easier if you mess up on the metallics to fix it first than after you've already painted the skin to go back and try to fix. If you put silver over skin tone, it's really hard to fix that. Whereas if you put skin tone over silver, it's relatively easy to fix that. So again, I try to go in order of what's going to be harder to fix because I do make mistakes. I do run over parts of the model that I've already painted on occasion. I try really hard not to, but it happens. Maybe it wouldn't happen if I was a little more precise or if I wasn't talking the whole time while painting or, you know, whatever else. But you can never guarantee that you won't make mistakes. What you can do is try to future-proof by painting in such a way that your mistakes won't matter as much. All right, so there's the nice silver hilt there. All right, so now we're gonna use a gold on the pommel of his cane. And also he's got like some buttons and some filigree on his jacket because of course he does. So we're gonna come in very carefully, trying to miss where the fingers will be and just get around that with the gold. Probably Not the best angle to be able to see that gold, sorry, but trust me, dear viewer, it is there. Now, they did a mean thing to me when they modeled this, which is that his fingers are actually splayed out on the pommel here, so I have a choice to make. Do I try to put the gold in between the fingers, not getting it on the fingers, or do I just paint the fingers, running the paint over the area that technically should be gold and making it look like it's supposed to be not gold? I'm gonna try to paint the gold just a little bit here without getting it up onto the fingers, but I don't love where that's going, so I'm probably not gonna do it a ton. Probably just gonna paint the hands, and by the time that it's done, it's such a small part of the model that you're not gonna notice unless you're, looking at it with a very nice camera that's all zoomed in, etc. But who would do that? All right, so now that we've got that, we're gonna paint some gold onto the kind of brocade on his chest. And again, just being careful not to spread it on everything else. He's got some buttons here. We'll paint them gold as well because he is a vampire and, again, a fancy guy. He's not gonna have like regular buttons. He's gonna have gold buttons. And that is all of the metallics on this miniature. There's not a lot of the metallics there, but it does just kind of help emphasize the difference between the contrast, which comes out very matte, very flat, and the metallics, which come out very shiny, which is, of course, the point. All right, so while all of that is drying, which I want it to dry before I do the hands, because the hands are going to be on there, let's go ahead and paint those rat faces and rat tails. Now this one I'm actually going to use a different paint. I don't actually love the contrast paint of the skin tone that I have. This one's just a little thicker and I think works better for the rat tails. It does, however, come in a dropper bottle. So I'm going to put this is just a silicone paint container. It looks very similar though to those little pop fidget toy things. So you could literally just buy one of those little fidget pop things and use that. Silicone is non-stick. It's gonna work great. When the paint dries out, you just pop it the other way and then the paint pops out of there. So we're gonna try on one of the lower rat faces, seeing if I like the tone of this without thinning it down, because I don't want it to be too dark, which sometimes this is. All right, we wanna give that, again, that idea that this is a rat. It's, got that kind of gross, fleshy, pinkish stuff. Sorry to any fans of rats out there. I actually think that looks good without having to thin it down more. So we're just gonna use that consistency and then start filling in the other rat faces. Here's the one where I should have painted back over the ear, but I didn't. So now it's just gonna look, it kind of looks like he actually lost an ear, which works. This is a vampire with a cloak. All right, his cloak has probably been through it a little bit. It's not, these are dead rats. They're not coming back. They're not getting any younger. So I kind of like the idea that one of them lost an ear. So we're just working our way around here, painting all the ears, making sure that we get everything that we didn't paint earlier when we painted the cloak. Get the heads over here. Oh, I almost missed the head below his arm here. So many rat heads. You're getting the sense that this guy might not be a good dude. I think that is intentional, right? I think they modeled this. So it's like, okay, walk me through the process. How'd you decide that you should have a cloak made out of rats? And by the way, when we say rats, like these are some giant rats. These are not like little rats. These are some big rats. Dire rats, maybe. So I see an area here with this rat head that I probably should have painted gray, but I missed it earlier. And I don't think it's gonna look that different, so I just painted it the flesh tone instead. And this rat has a bit longer of a head, we shall say. All right, so one more rat head over here. Oh, I lied, there's another rat head. And this guy has so many rat heads on his cloak that even I am losing track of how many rat heads he has. All right, so just the one more now. Make sure that we get enough coverage to finish this out, and then I'm going to need to pour a little more of the paint because we need the same color for the rat tails. I think it'll tie together the cloak that he has, or the stole, if you will, of the rat heads, and then coming out the bottom of his cape, he's got the rat tails, and we want all that to tie together as kind of one thing, right, to read visually as being of a piece with one another. So I need just a little bit more of this paint to do that. Now, earlier before the video started, I did paint the base black because that'll work better for how I'm eventually going to do cobblestones on the base. But I got a little bit of the black onto the rat tails, so I went back through with my white primer paint and just filled in on those rat tails back in white, try to make sure that they look the way that I want them to. And one thing I am noticing is these pink rat tails are coming out a little reddish if I let the paint stay on too thick. And right next to the red cloak, it's a bit of a problem. So I wonder if I caught a little bit of the red of the cloak on my brush. I'm gonna rinse off my brush, try to see if that helps. And make sure I'm getting both sides. There's just enough definition to these rat tails that one pass of the paintbrush isn't quite getting the whole thing. I need to kind of do one side and then come around and do the other side. So I apologize, I know it means I'm switching the mini back and forth a lot, but that means that it will, at the end of the day, all look the way that it's supposed to from whatever angle you look at the model. And that's really the goal, is kind of consider like what angles are people going to look at the model from, and those are the angles you want it to look good. So like I don't worry too much about the underside of models. Like I do paint it so there's not just like a white unpainted section. Need a little bit more paint here. But I'm not as concerned about the underside of the model because no one's really going to see that from the tabletop. When you have the model displayed, people are usually looking down at it. And so really you want to make sure that from the top down things look good and from side to side they look good, because that's how most people are going to interact with your art. Right? This is one of those areas where you kind of control what angle people are likely to see the piece from, and so you can make sure that everything lines up on that angle the way you want it to. All right, one more rat tail here, and then his rat tails will be complete. I keep saying rat tails, and I mean literal rat tails here, but I do love the image of him with his little Anakin Skywalker Padawan learner rat tail. Fortunately, he does not have one of those. He looks gross enough already. He doesn't need to add to it. I thought that I wanted a rat tail as a kid because I loved Star Wars, as every kid did. But my mom, who loves me very much, very wisely told me, no, you cannot grow out one piece of your hair longer than the rest and then braid it. That will look terrible. And she was right. So I'm glad that she prevented me from going down that path. Thank you very much, Mom. All right, so there we go. We've got the gross, fleshy rat tails and rat heads for this model all painted up. And now the only thing on him that hasn't been painted yet is his skin. Now, normally for the skin, I would do actually a tone similar to the rat heads, but I don't want his skin to look like the rat heads, and he's a vampire. He's been dead for a while. So I'm actually gonna use this very thin gray, and this is why I've been trying to be so protective of the skin portions as we're going through, because this gray really is only barely gonna cover the white that I've primed it. It's just gonna give some definition to that white. Some painters spend a lot of time painting eyes, etc. I'll admit eyes are not something I am very good at, but also I kind of love how with this gray it pools down into the eye sockets to where you can't really see the eyes. They're just kind of like this dark gray shadow, and I like the way that that makes it look for the vampires, like they're kind of mysterious, kind of ashen, that these are not just humans, right? That these are undead creatures who can't go out in the sunlight. They become very pale, very gaunt. I'm gonna draw this gray down over the fingers as well. Make sure I get up on the wrist so that way it doesn't just look like he has white hands, but that he has this, again, this kind of pallid gray skin. And then we're gonna do that with the other hand here. Almost there. Fill in the last bit on that hand. And now we've got the whole model painted, at least in its base colors. There are some like extra finishing steps I want to do, but he went from being all white to having all of these colors all laid out, all together. All right, so now that I've got all the colors that I want on him, they're gonna go back to the hilt of that sword, given it a bit of time to dry. Let me wash out this brush. It's a little drier than I'd like. But I'm gonna use what's called a wash. This is like a very thin pigment that's almost more like a liquid. I mean, I guess all paint is liquid. But what it does is if you paint it just around these raised edges here on the hilt, it's gonna cling to the low part of those edges, and it's gonna give the sword this sense of definition that there are shadows to it. And it'll actually dry kind of glossy, this one that I have, and it'll add to that metallic effect. I'm gonna try to get it up a little here on the cross guard as well. So that way it's not just a metallic paint here, it's a metallic paint that's got some shadow, some definition, etc. Don't love how I got a little bit of silver onto the rat here, so I'm gonna use the wash to cover that up to make my life easier. So now that I've used that wash there, I have a different colored wash that's kind of a orangish brownish wash that I'm going to use for the gold. Now it's only barely visible. There's not a whole lot of gold on the model. All right, if I can get it to stay open. But there is this ring around his cane here, so I'm going to give that a little bit of definition with the wash. And then he's got this gold brocade on his front, so I'm gonna just run some wash down along the edges there so it won't look quite so flat, so it'll have a little bit more definition to it. You could probably skip those steps if you wanted to, but I think they make it look nice and help it pop. So now the final thing I'm going to do is, he's a vampire. He's got to have some blood on him. So I have this paint here that is very thick. You can see it actually kind of glooping down into the bottom. And when you put it on, it dries glossy, kind of like blood. So what I'm gonna do is just kind of dab it a little bit on like the corners of his mouth and dribble it down. And I'm being a little messy here. I like the idea that this guy, like, he's a little more refined. I have some vampires I just like the whole mouth I did with the red. He's just gonna have it on one side here. But I don't want it to just look like I'm painting a line. I want it to kind of pool a little bit as it comes down and give the impression that he perhaps snacked a bit too much, as there's some blood that's now staining his doublet, but it's not his blood. I love the way that this kind of blood effect paint then looks over metallics. So I'm gonna have it come down onto his belt a little bit. I don't love the way that that side piece looks like I painted to the side, so I'm gonna go above it a little bit to even it out so it kind of looks more like it's flowing down that way. And I love the way that it's like not on this side, but it's all over on this side, and you can see it there. Now, I'm gonna use that same blood effect, and I imagine he has skewered some people with this sword. So I'm just kind of gonna work it down the blade a little bit thicker at the tip of the blade, because this sword looks more like a sword you would use for stabbing than a sword you would use for slashing. So we're gonna try to put it on kind of thick at the tip and then just kind of work it down with the paintbrush so that there's a little bit of it lower down on the blade but less of it, so you can see more of that original color. And then we'll get it on the underside a little as well. It would look a little weird if the blood was just on the top of the blade and not the underside of the blade. And that's gonna give us this nicely blood-slicked blade look. And once it dries, it's really going to, you'll be able to see how it shines different than the rest of the paints that we use. And it'll really look like he has this like wet, glistening blood on there. Now, question is, do I put a little blood on his hands? Sometimes I do with the vampires, the idea that they've kind of been grabbing, but I think I like the idea that this guy keeps his hands clean, right? That he has his, fangs, and of course he's a vampire, he's gonna use those, but he's got this long sword that he's gonna stab people with from a long way away, so he's not gonna get his hands dirty. He's going to use his sword instead. And with that, I think he is done everything except the base, but that's going to take a little bit of time to paint all the cobblestone squares for the base, and I'm not going to do that in this video. Thanks for watching, everybody.